Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Stecklein, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Appreciate people taking the time today to learn with me on a topic titled Leader Standard Work, otherwise known as, and by some people, a personal management system. I've called this part one because I think there'll be a couple iterations of this. Going to go through some slides here, some introductory material. Folks that have been on our webinars in the past understand that generally we do this. We put the phones on mute so that we have minimal background noise, but there's going to be some pause times that I'm going to unmute the phones for an opportunity for people to interact and also ask any questions if they would like. You can also use the chat function on the webinar to put any questions out there, any comments. This is being recorded so that you can benefit from the recording later on and also share it with any others that might benefit from the topic. So a little background here. Some of this was discussed in our last webinar on the Managing for Daily Improvement system. So some of this may be repetitive, but it also builds into what we're going to be talking about as far as leader standard work. So ask most any person in an organization what they do, where they work. They might draw a picture like this of an organizational chart. It's a useful view. It tells you who reports to who, lines of responsibilities. Doesn't necessarily connect to how it's related to the customers, though. And we wrote a white paper on this topic called Side-by-Side Management that does a little play on this pyramid view of the organization, and we call it side by side because it requires you keep the structure this way, but you just turn it counterclockwise 45 degrees or 90 degrees rather, and you see it in a different view, and you can see the same responsibilities here. We have leaders, managers, frontline, general categories of roles and responsibilities in an organization, and how people at the front line closest to the customers doing the value added work, value created work, managers supporting them, leaders supporting managers, looking at it that way. And building on that, this idea about where do people spend their time. And we find that in many organizations, looking at these general categories of leaders, managers, frontline, there is a desire for leaders to develop and deploy strategy, communicate that strategy. Most everyone finds a lot of their time being spent, however, in managing by results, reactive management, a lot of best efforts and hard work, which one terminology we use for that is people find that their culture becomes one of firefighting, workarounds, and heroic efforts. And just a general view about how this might look like and where that resides in many organizations, not all, but many. And what would better look like? What sort of cut might we see in an organization related to think about strategy and operations, just a general way to think about it. And if we had a better balance, we would see that leaders are attending to the problems of the future, preparing the organization for the future. How do we position ourselves strategically? What do we need to do? Managers understanding that, then being able to translate that to the front line in their areas of responsibility. People at the front line needing to understand enough about the goals and strategies of the organization and what they need to do to fit in. The bottom pyramid to the lower right shows how much time would you want people spending in managing for daily improvement and the operations. And it's sort of a reverse view of the other triangle that way. Now, taking it one step further, thinking about the primary systems that you would like to see in an organization, just making that translation to this triangle here. Strategy system could be thought about as we develop strategy, we deploy strategy, and then we monitor and evaluate how well we are deploying that strategy. And everyone has some role to play, some spending more time in it than others. And the managing for daily improvement system, this other triangle here, looking at it this way, how do we translate for every department what is ours to do? How does it connect to strategy? How are we working with to improve our work systems, enabling everyone to be engaged in that, and really working on aligning all of the departments together to accomplish that. So this slice in the middle, we just opened this up and said there's another sort of system that you can think about. Let's think about it as the standard work system. And it kind of comes in two parts. There is standard work for leaders, and I categorize that as both in the yellow for both leaders and managers, anybody that has areas of responsibility, people working with them, working for them, reporting to them, could be areas of responsibility for key processes. And then also the people at the front line, still standard work, but a different type of standard work. And I'll be getting into that a little bit, at least our viewpoint here on how this might make sense. Standard work, you could think about this is how we do the work. Improving the work. Improving the work is also part of the work. So think about that distinction there. We decide what needs to be standardized and what we're all going to do in a certain routine, but always looking to how do we continuously improve that way. The slice or the triangle in the upper left-hand corner is a topic of our white paper that we most recently wrote, the Pracademics Guide to Strategy Deployment. And if you want to reference that white paper, you can find it at that bit.ly link. The topic of managing for daily improvement was a topic of our last webinar. And if you go to that bit.ly link, you can refer to the recording there. So today's topic is really going to be around that middle piece, and specifically around the leader standard work piece for this discussion. Now, another consideration here is over time, where might you see transitions going relative to roles and responsibility? The left-hand side picture shows that in a lot of organizations, management has a big burden to try to get into alignment, but also problem-solving, communication. How strongly and actively involved the frontline staff in that is, on the left-hand side, you can see over time, might increase over time. And the theory is over time, you would want more transition from what management is doing into this frontline staff so that they're fully engaged and working on improving the work in the managing for daily improvement. It isn't always a straight line, though, and in actual practice, it looks more like this, that you can see some attempts to try to involve more frontline staff, delegate more from management to transition over to the frontline staff, but then it tends to go up, tends to go down, and it isn't always a straight line process. And also, these little arrows, I'm going to expand this a little bit to show that at any point in time, it isn't necessarily evident or true that progression is going to continue upward. And the process is always trying to go to a chaotic situation. So Dr. Deming's advice is no system manages itself. There's no autopilot here for this. It requires constant infusion of energy and attention in order to help make this transition and helping the frontline staff be more involved and engaged in the daily improvement work. I like this quote from James Womack. He says, "All processes have a desperate desire to head toward chaos, to get worse fast. The only thing standing in the way is management." So it does require constant attention to try to continue that upward path. And management will always have a role, of course, and that's why it doesn't go to zero. But you want to try to think about how can you get more people involved into that managing for daily improvement role. Now, the metaphor that I've been thinking about and using, taking this picture of the two triangles and the slice in the middle, I started thinking about Oreo cookies. And the top part of the cookie, the chocolate part on the top, you can think about as the strategy system. The strategy system for everyone in the organization. What are we as an organization working toward? What do we focus on? What are we trying to do to prepare for the future? The bottom part of that cookie, you can think about it is every department, every area has its own bottom part. What are we doing in our department in order to align to the strategy to try to help to everyone to continuously improve, align to the important aspects of what the organization is working toward. And again, this was the topic of our last webinar. So that filling in the middle, think about that as the leader standard work. What connects the two? How does leadership have a routine that they're attending to every day, every week, to try to continuously connect between strategy and managing for daily improvement? And I just put in some bullet points there as far as what are they doing. I think they're aligning. I think they're communicating. They're constantly assessing the health of the systems. And they're also doing some coaching. And we're going to be getting into some of those aspects related to this. So I want to take a bit of a pause here, just review. It's sometimes helpful to say, so here's what we're going to talk about. Just want to do a quick review. We talked about the reverse or the adjusted view of a pyramid view of an organization. Talked about the prevailing style, which is not necessarily ideal as far as a sharing of responsibilities, as far as connecting to strategy and managing for daily improvement. What would more balanced look like? And also, what are some of the key systems that we're going to be talking about, and then looking at it that way. Talk briefly about what happens with a progression over time with energy as far as making that transition from managers to frontline as far as participation. And then the entropy that tends to occur if we don't give it sufficient energy and infusion of energy. And then finally, this metaphor of an Oreo cookie is just a symbolic way to think about this, that it's a handy way to try to unpack it as well. So what I want to do is I want to unmute and want to see what input people have, what I've shared with you so far. How does this compare with your experience in your work in your organization or as your role as a leader on any of these topics? And would you add or change anything to the background before we proceed? So I'm going to pause and see if anyone has any input. Okay, assuming this makes sense, I'm going, oh, there's a comment here that's showing up here. It says, this aligns perfectly. Okay, I'll take that as input that where people are tracking so far, this makes sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return to the mute function just to minimize any background noise, and we're going to proceed on and build on some of these topics with this. So before we proceed, what do we need to think as we think about this? One way to think about this is, what's our mindset? The recommendation I'm thinking about is that the mindset to think more about gardening and less like a machine is a useful mindset to have. Another thing that we need to think about is some sort of a framework or a foundation for experimenting relative to experimenting with leader standard work. That's our topic for today. And then thirdly, some idea about scaffolding. Scaffolding is something, here's scaffolding for a building. You can even think about scaffolding for a garden. You put a trellis up there and that's where you want the plants to try to grow, to hang on, whether it's something like tomato plants or grapevine or whatever. So some sort of scaffolding. And I'm going to be breaking these down into specific parts here and talking about how we're going to use, think about mindset, framework, and scaffolding for experiments around leader standard work. So first of all, mindset. One of the key mindsets to think about is this idea that systems evolve going from simple to complex. Now, what does this look like? Well, early on, it might look like a bunch of tools. Think about leader standard work. It could be a form. It could be going on a Gemba walk. It could be measures that people are looking at. So there's a lot of different stuff that people might have as far as what they're practicing, which is a common start. So it's a personal management system, thinking about how am I going to devote my time, whether it's thinking about today, this week, this month. How do I put my energy? How do I make sure that I'm doing the things that I need to do to try to make the connection? Over time, those tools you will see start to connect with each other, and you can see that I see how the huddle connects to the board, connects to an X matrix, and I can see that it's starting to form some systems. and you're sharing your personal management system with each other, and you're sharing with your boss or your peers. Here's what I'm doing to try to align my work and focus my work for the time period, and you're starting to share that with each other. And then you're going to start to see some functional integration, how you can see between leaders and managers the work that they're doing, between strategy and managing for daily improvement. And it starts to maybe look like this. You can see that overlap where the leader has his or her standard work, the manager has his or her standard work, and how does that connect to the improvement work and the standard work for the front line? So you're starting to see that to connect. And as it evolves, if the energy continues to be infused in it, people can tend to pay attention to it, it's going to be a way that we do things, the way we have our leader standard work function across the organization. And it tends to work that way. Now, before we get into the next topic around the framework, I just want to say more about if we believe that it is true that the mindset is more like encouraging a garden and to grow and less like managing a machine. An important consideration to think about is Dr. Deming's quote on there is no instant pudding for any of this. And you can find this reference. It's one of the obstacles to transformation in his book, Out of the Crisis. So one reason why we see people rush to simple solutions and also a broad belief, or a belief that if everyone were to do things the same way, then we'll be able to accomplish this. And they're sort of treating it as if it's sort of a certain kind of problem. So to talk about this, I want to reference the white paper that we wrote called Practical Wisdom, and the bit.ly link is there. But I just want to briefly go through this idea about different kinds of problems require different sorts of knowledge. And so this is a topic that's related to this white paper. And I do have a reason for getting into this, just to talk about what happens when we tend to take simple solutions and try to push them onto other folks, or at least try to say we must all do it the same way. So if we think about a continuum of problems, we have some on this side which are more convergent and some that are more divergent on this side. Convergent means coming together. And an example of what that looks like is if I were to give you this problem to solve, if I were to say, call it problem A, here's a square. Now draw another square that has twice the area of that square. And people can try different things and they can try to do that. But I could also say, here's how you do it. You take the diagonal of that square and then make a new square, and it's going to have twice the area of that square. This is an example of a convergent problem. And what I mean by that is I can give you the solution and you can carry it out and you can be successful in solving the problem, and you don't have to go through any intellectual effort to try to understand why it works. Now, we do have some problems that are like this, where we can say, when you see this, here's the solution. But I want to compare that problem with some other problems here. And the next problem I want to talk about is a problem that gets away from the abstract world, but gets into the real material world. So suppose you have some object and you drop it from some height and you want to know how fast is it going when it reaches its terminal velocity. So that's problem B. It's moved over closer to the divergent side because we're no longer dealing in the abstract world, we're dealing in the real material world. Now there is a formula I can give you and you can plug it in and it will work pretty well. But you're losing the ability to be able to predict because now we're dealing with the real material world. And you really don't know what's going to happen when you drop that object. Something may come along and grab it, something may stop its path, and you couldn't have predicted it. But I can still give you a formula and you'll still be successful, but we're moving away from the purely predictable outcomes that we want to get. Now I want to introduce another problem, and this introduces the human element into this, which really is a characterization of the divergent world. So if I said bake 2 loaves of white bread, I could give you a recipe. It could be the same recipe I would give to you. But the ability to make bread means that I'm trying to make something happen through a human being. And people develop different skills of bread making. There's also variation in the ingredients, variation in the climate, variation in the altitude. There's a lot of different variables. So the ability to take a skill and translate it into something that becomes an art is an example of this type of problem. Now, you're also dealing with a human being who has a free will of his or her own, and you're always trying to make things happen through people. And when you start treating people as if they weren't people, then you run counter against the divergent nature, which gets us into problem D. So problem D, an example of problem D is educate a child in this day and age to be an informed critical thinker in the future. Well, what kind of recipe could I possibly give to you? I could say, well, send this person to the right school or the right teachers or the right curriculum. But when you're dealing with a divergent problem, there are no simple recipes. There's no handy formula I can give. You're really trying to apply different types of knowledge. Now, in Dr. Deming's 1993 book, he broke that type of knowledge down into understanding variation, appreciation for a system, psychology, and theory of knowledge, and that kind of knowledge. In different translation, you may talk about different principles that are at play and better understanding those principles. So the reason I say all this is when we're trying to develop a leader standard work system, it isn't as simple as giving somebody a tool and saying, here, use this and it will work. You need to really understand psychology. You need to understand variation. You need to understand what's going to work for this or that person in this or that situation, and different types of knowledge is needed. So that's a little bit of a sidebar that I wanted to talk about. Why do we run into difficulties when people want to try to treat something that can be very complex, can be a divergent problem, and they try to toss a simple solution to it, and it's not going to work? So away from that one, now I want to go to the second topic around framework. We need to have some sort of a framework to think about what's going to be the foundation for experimentation. So I introduced the framework already, thinking about the two triangles and the slice in the middle, or if you prefer the Oreo cookie, that's our framework for experimentation. And then scaffolding. Now, I introduced this with the last webinar, and we've had several topics or conversations on this topic around using our system build approach to design or adjust any system. And there's a white paper. You can go to the bit.ly link in the upper right-hand corner. Any system you want to adjust, any system you want to improve, using this scaffolding as a guide to say, first let's work on the system, then let's work in the system to do our experimentation, is a great way to proceed. And again, it's not something as simple as a recipe that I can give you, but over time with practice, people have found it to be beneficial. I put an asterisk there just to point out that scaffolding, this type of a framework can be a good scaffolding. Another example of scaffolding is having good coaching. So if you have a knowledgeable coach that's helping to guide your efforts on what you're trying to do, that's another type of scaffolding to try to see what needs to be done and experiment that way. So having some scaffolding. Now, related to leader standard work, there's been a lot of experiments that people have been doing on this, and many people have shared how this has worked for them. I just want to walk through how you would use this scaffolding if you're looking at leader standard work and see how it might be beneficial. So the first step is to be clear. Let's work on the system. Let's understand what the purpose of leader standard work is. And getting clear on that purpose, then understanding if I could identify the key principles of enterprise excellence that I think are the most important related to that system, then I can use that to define what are the ideal behaviors for the key players that I would like to see show up in this system. Now, the behaviors I'm looking for primarily, depending upon what your role is, what is my behavior? What behavior do I want this system to drive for me or for the people that work with me? So it's primarily around these two aspects, whether you're at a leader role in an organization or a manager role of an organization. What are the ideal behaviors that you would like to see this system drive? And then the final part here on this part is, so this is what I want to see. the purpose. These are the principles that I'm trying to use. This is what we will do. And then number 4, the outcomes is what we're going to get. And you want to think high level as far as getting more of this, less of that. When you've had some time to think about the on the system aspect, and again, you'll get more information on this if you refer to that white paper that I talked about. The purpose of today's webinar is not to go through this in detail, to just say that this scaffolding can be an important approach to help you to have a successful experiment in leader standard work. So thinking of experimenting, that's what happens when you get to working in the system, which means thinking about, so what would be a simple process that I could experiment with that I think is going to drive those behaviors that I talked about, achieve that purpose, and then get those outcomes. So start with some simple process steps. And then think about what are some of the most essential tools that I might be able to use in my experiment. What kinds of triggers am I going to need? And I'll have a little bit more about what do I mean by triggers shortly. And then what kind of measurements should I have to know how is my experiment going, which is not the same as outcomes as I mentioned previously, but it's connected to outcomes. And then finally, if I have a renewal mechanism or a period of time that I will periodically come back and assess how this system is working, top to bottom, both on the system and in the system, and I do that on a routine basis, I'm more likely to be successful to develop a sustained leader standard work system that improves over time. Again, going to the metaphor of gardening, I'm going to be attending to it on a regular basis. So regular review is that final aspect. So what might this process look like? I've found in doing work with folks that it's a great start to think about a week at a time. What does this mean? Well, part of my process is going to include some steps related to planning. When am I planning? What's going to happen related to my work? Then it goes to doing, and doing always includes some time to go to the Gemba, go see what's going on. That's one of the things that I will be doing. And then study, and then adjust. So some time for reflection and adjusting so that I'm thinking about how do I make the following week work even better. So what does this look like? I want to tie some things together here. So we have on the system, here's the purpose. What are the behaviors that I want to see? What kind of outcomes am I going to get? These are the outputs of a system. This is the process steps. And these are some of the inputs. So you can think about the SIPOC acronym, and I've just taken the middle 3 and looking at inputs, process, and outputs here. An uplink system and a downlink system is part of what we're thinking about here. Uplink system to my leader standard work is going to be strategy deployment, understanding what's mine to do relative to strategy deployment is going to be an input in how am I trying to connect the strategy of the organization through my leader standard work to managing for daily improvement for the departments for which I may be responsible. And I may have a number of departments, and each of them would have a managing for daily improvement system. So how am I continuously helping them make that linkage between strategy deployment and moving forward in their areas of responsibility with managing for daily improvement? So that's one way to think about it. Now, there's many tools that are going to show up in a leader standard work system, and it tends to be interactive, not necessarily linear. So some of these tools might be things such as, here's a list of meetings that I go to, and it might be a note-taking form. Some time to go see, some time to gamma. I might have a visual tracking tool. I might have a huddle that I go to, or one or more huddles. There may be an accountability card or some sort of a board. And a personal Kanban is sometimes a tool that is helpful for leaders to have. Now, there's a separate webinar on the idea of this personal Kanban, and for those that aren't familiar with it, you might want to go to that bit.ly link at the top. It's a short video that explains how the personal Kanban works. Some people are familiar with, say, a team Kanban, but the same thing works for individual. The two concepts related to a personal Kanban is first of all, make all of your work visible. So every possible thing that you might be working on, each of those are those little task boxes. And then limit your work in process. Only those things in those boxes are the ones that I'm actually working on. So briefly, how does this work? Some things are in process. They're going to move to the done category. Some things I'm doing, I'm going to move to in process. Maybe I've delegated it to someone else or I'm waiting for someone else to do. I now have capacity in my work in process. So I'm going to take the next one up that's ready and move it into what I'm doing. And then something new comes in. I go to a meeting. I have some input. I'm going to put it here. And then I'm going to move things forward so that I know which one I'm going to do next, which one is then going to be next in the queue. And that webinar, just briefly before I go to a review, this webinar up here on the top also has some great references to learn more about personal Kanban. So I found that it's a useful tool for people to have available as part of their system if they want to have better leader standard work. So I want to take another pause. I want to then unmute a bit and see if there's any questions or feedback. So I talked about the mindset. Think about being a gardener and not being a mechanic. And I took a little sidebar on the reason why we fall into the trap of trying to push tools onto people or treating it like a machine. The framework, just using the two triangles and the slice in the middle, or the Oreo cookie, if you want to think about that. And then the scaffolding. So the system build approach that we advise people to experiment with and try related to working on the system, then experimenting working in the system in this manner. So the categories of working on the system, working in the system, thinking about a period of time for the process steps to be described. I like a week. Some people include what does it mean every day? Some people think about every month. Just thinking about a period of time and how do I go through the main categories of planning, doing, study, and adjust as I proceed that way. And then thinking about the uplink and downlink systems. That's the two parts of the Oreo cookie, the strategy deployment on the left, the managing for daily improvement on the right, and how leader standard work helps to connect those two. And then looking at the different tools that are within a system. So I'm going to pause again. I'm going to unmute. I'm going to get any input that people have on experiments you've done, things you've tried, how this, if you've tried the system build approach, how it's worked, anything related to these topics. I'm just going to pause and see if there's any review or questions. And you can also type something in if you don't want to talk out loud.
Hello, Mike. This is Dirk. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just from our experience, we've tried to implement leader standard work in several ways at different times with different levels of success. And I think the addition of the systems framework is really useful to help create that structure. So I think that's a useful addition of presenting this and how to go about building this. So that's just a comment and feedback. And then the other point I wanted to raise was, I think it's really important to also identify up front, and you touched on that in the beginning, is what's the problem we're trying to solve with this? I think oftentimes as lean thinkers and lean practitioners, we tend to gloss over that a little bit too much instead of teasing that out first. We kind of build the case and whet the appetite for our audience to actually move in this direction.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate that, Dirk. Thanks for those comments. Okay, going to move forward, continue on. I want to say a bit more about triggers because it's an important thing to think about as you are trying to practice a new skill or a new habit. And I like the advice from B.J. Fogg, who's at Stanford University, and you go to his website and you can see this called the Fogg behavior model, and has to do with the relationship between our motivation level and ability, whether things are high, whether our motivation is high or low on the left, and whether the ability is easy to do or hard to do on the right. And thinking about the relationship between those two. The behavior we want to see shows up when we have sufficient motivation, that's the M, plus sufficient ability, that's the A, plus a trigger that says do this now. So how do we think about this? If something is hard to do and we have low motivation and a trigger shows up, it's not going to work because that's not going to happen. We don't have a match there. It also, we could be highly motivated to do something, but it's really hard to do and it's not going to show up. And it could be easy for us to do. We just aren't motivated to do something and that's not going to show up. So this zone right here shows when is the behavior going to show up and when are we likely to be successful there in this zone related to the interaction between motivation, ability, and trigger. Now what this means is as we proceed, and it kind of goes back to this idea of building things as a garden, think about what you can affect. You can't affect motivation. People would like to affect a person's motivation, but that's really not proved to be successful. What you can affect is how do you make it easy? How do you make it as simple as possible? So thinking in terms of baby steps, how to practice some simple steps, getting successful at that, and over iteration, then being able to build on that and be able to progress to eventually harder things to do. Now I'm glossing over a lot of great stuff. I highly recommend you refer to this model, but it's very helpful to think about how do I create, and this is what we mean by affecting the system. When you change the system, you're increasing or decreasing the ability. You're making it easier or harder. So thinking about how do I simplify, how do I take baby steps, and how do I practice in a simple manner before I take on perhaps some harder things. Now there's another great metaphor that I like here, and this came from a webinar that my friend Mike Grogan did some time ago, and the link to his recording is on the lower left-hand corner. But he uses the acronym of Messi, which is also the last name of the soccer player you see at the right. I saw some of his videos this week, and he really did some phenomenal stuff. But he uses this acronym when he's thinking about not the soccer player, but Mike Grogan uses this that says, how do I think about habit creation? And he likes this metaphor, and I've used it a lot, and I think it makes good sense. So think about how do I make the habit meaningful? How do I make it easy? Going back to BJ Fogg's metaphor. How do I make it social? Which means if I tell other people I'm trying to practice a new behavior and get them involved, they can also be helpful triggers for me to remind me of what I'm trying to do. The second S stands for setback ready. I know I'm going to have some times when I'm going to fall off the path as far as what I'm trying to do. And what's my plan when I have setbacks? How do I get back on the path? And then the final idea is incentives. What can you do to give yourself an incentive or a treat or some sort of a kudo to say, I have been successful with my practice? And the more you can practice this sort of metaphor over and over again, more likely you're going to see those habits take hold. So I like those two references, whether it's BJ Fogg's model or the Messi model from Mike Grogan, as far as advice on habit creation, because that's really what's going on here with leader standard work. You're trying to practice new habits. Related to measures, this is an example from a team working with, they identified there's a few behaviors they wanted to be practicing. And so they just listed them out. And my question was, so think about a measure. How can you tell if you were successful day by day? And a simple checklist, check mark, yes or no, I did it. You could also have a way to keep track of reasons why I didn't get to it. And this is what I mean by measure, something simple that you can use that can track your personal, call it adherence to, or how well you were successful in the process steps that you defined, whether it was spending time going to Gemba, time coaching, time practicing, delegating, whatever you said you were going to try. And how do you have measures on that, because when you get to review this, you want to have some data to be able to say, if I said every month I want to review my leader standard work and I want to reflect on it, having some data to say, so how did I do, can be very helpful and instrumental, as opposed to saying, well, I think I did okay. So it's a new habit to get into, some reminder for some data measurement. Another important thing to think about is when people develop these forms or tools, whatever they're using with leader standard work, I think it's helpful to remember that these are intended to be working documents. Carry them around with you, write on them, use them. Use them for note taking, use them for prompts, use it for measurement, use it for reflection. However you design your form that makes sense for you. Remember that it's not something that you put in a binder and hope to remember. Carrying it around and using it is a helpful way to think about. Now, an example of this, Laura Brown from Memorial Care did a nice webinar for us in the past. The link to her webinar recording is in the lower right-hand corner. And she shared the note-taking book that she carries around, and this was how she was tracking. I said I was going to do this, how well did I do it? And then she used it for reflecting and adjusting her leader standard work. So she called them scheduled leader check-ins, and then tracking her key behavior indicators as far as how this was working. I want to say more about how the leader standard work can connect with each level. If you had executives that were experimenting on leader standard work, designing it, using the system build approach that we recommend, or some other method, but anyway, if they were doing it, if the people at the, say at the manager level were doing their experiments and the supervisors were doing it and then connecting it to the frontline staff, you would see that over time, with collaboration and over time, you're going to see things becoming more common. People share their tools. They start to look more common. They find that there is more. They see the interaction between them, and they see how they support each other in this. So I just want to go back to this one I showed previously and just remind the audience that it starts with personal management system tools. It evolves into what's the beginning of systems. People share them with each other. It becomes connected. People see the connections, and then they start to see how it works together as a leader standard work system. Too often I see people want to start from the right-hand side and saying it must all look like this when we're said and done, and do you see how all of these connect? And that tends to treat it more like a machine and less like something you're trying to grow organically as a garden. So my recommendation is to think about gardening. Now, another framework that I like related to this is, and we've shared this on webinars in the past, is the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework. I'm going to say a bit about how this fits into this idea of leader standard work on this slide. There's a link on the lower left-hand side to a previous webinar. This comes from the good folks at the Cognitive Edge, Dave Snowden and his group. But when I think about the different types of systems or domains I might find themselves in, I might be in something that in the upper left-hand corner is complex, a lot of moving parts affecting each other, and some of which I don't actually know all of the parts that are at play. I might be in the upper right-hand corner where things are complicated, a lot of different parts, but I understand cause and effect, and I'm trying to figure out how to improve it. I might be in a domain that is in the obvious, lower right-hand corner. I know what to do, and it's obvious what should be done. The relationship between the obvious and the chaotic on the lower left-hand corner, this symbol here, is intended to be a cliff. If I overly constrain a system and people get into conformity zone, they can fall off the edge into chaos. So what this means, I'm going to walk through this and related to leader standard work. If I see that developing leader standard work can be complex, I want to think about some simple, safe to fail experiments that I can try. Some of them are going to work, some are not. the things that work, I'm going to give them more energy. I might be able to move things over to the complicated domain and say, I now see a cause and effect relationship that when I do this, I get these results. I might go back and forth between experiments and the complicated domain, but some things I'm going to move down to obvious when it makes sense. And this gets into, call it standard work, or the current best way that we're going to do this. So as people's systems evolve and people work together as a team, they're going to say, you know, the current best way that we should do this is this manner. And you can move some things down into the obvious domain. There is a back and forth, I think, that occurs between when you think you've got good, call it standard work developed, and then something changes over time and you need to go back and understand root causes. And again, avoiding the trap of trying to overly constrain, pushing tools onto people, saying that all must look the same. If you get into the complacency zone, people are going to find workarounds and ways to avoid what needs to be done, and it's going to get you into the chaos. So I like the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework as a way, again, to think about designing leader standard work, starting with personal leader standard work, and then evolving that over time. So I'm going to do a final review and then open up the phones and see what questions people might have. So I talked about BJ Fogg's model, looking at the behaviors, motivation, ability. Talked about the MESSI acronym that Mike Grogan likes with his habit creation. Talked about measures, how you can create some simple measures to understand how your process is working. Describe the idea of these are working documents, whatever tools you're working with, carry them around with you, use them that way. And then how over time, the leader standard work at the various levels of the organization will tend to evolve and look similar to each other, starts to be connected and everyone sees how it works together. So final advice as I'm thinking about this, and then I'm going to open it up. Start with what you have. There's always something going on with what you've got. Keep it simple. Try to be the gardener. And then I want to pause one more time and see what questions people might have with any of the topics that I've discussed in this brief time together today. Or comments or suggestions. Okay, I'll take that as a sign that people are ready to move on with their Good Friday celebration or weekend, whatever they would like to do. So what's going to happen next? This recording will show up on our webinars page on the IEX website, so you can find it here. It moves down into previous events, so you'll be able to find this recording. May 17th, friend and colleague Didier Robino is going to talk more about his view on leader standard work, and he's going to talk about it from the viewpoint of the frontline leader. So you can find information at that bit.ly link there. There's a number of things that are in the works, and people have suggested various things. I think there will be a Managing for Daily Improvement Part 2. Anne and Lou Fries have talked about doing something related to natural leadership, Part 2. I've had a conversation with Angela Swenson and Dirk that you heard on this webinar recording about lessons and learnings of a sensei. Kevin McNamara, who has he's a CEO at Tidy Products, and previously shared leader standard work, a great leader in this area and great role model, has agreed to come back and do further discussion and examples of leader standard work. Ken Eakin, Ken is in Canada, has offered to talk about office lean, understanding and implementing flow in professional administrative environments, designing and adjusting leader standard work. What I'd like to do is build some cadence with that. I want to do some more deep dives into complexity science and the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework. Jason Ewing, who did a webinar on hoarders of technology, is interested in some follow-up conversation on IT related. And then an idea from Garrett Bean, he said it would be great to have a webinar on the future on what it really means to own the principles, systems and tools, and corresponding behaviors. And it might be helpful for the rest of us have a clear picture what that might look like, or have something framed this way. Could be one or more several presenters. And so I think that would be great from what we would like to do. And we could put that together. I see some comments here coming from the chat function. And so it looks like Garrett's idea has some merit. So I'll be following up with anyone that would like to have further conversation about that. And we'll put together a future webinar with some presenters that way. So that would be great. Managing for daily improvement and leader standard work are the topics of the two latest white papers that we're working on. The last one we published was Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment. So these are almost done. Anytime we update a white paper or two, it also affects the other white papers. So there's a review and an update about how those are connected. Principle of the month is another thing that we're doing. So every week there's a blog post that you can reflect on. We're going through all of the principles throughout 2019, and you can get access to that through our IEX website, or you can get it through LinkedIn. The same reflection is on both of those. The previous ones for January are shown here, whether you go into our blog or if you go into LinkedIn. That's January, that's February, that's March, and we have 3 so far in April. There'll be another one on Monday related to create value for the customer. So through the course of a year, we'll have regular weekly reflections, short blog reflections on the guiding principles of enterprise excellence. So just as a reminder, if you have an improvement story or lessons to share, we're scheduling webinars for 2019. I'll follow up with anyone that put interest related to the suggestion from Garrett, and we'll follow up with those folks and have a discussion about that webinar. So I appreciate everyone's time today. We saved some time toward the end, so we didn't take the full hour. And hopefully everyone found some benefit from this time together. I hope everyone has a good day, good weekend, and if you're traveling, hopefully you have safe travels. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Mike. Happy Easter.
Okay.